Extremism. This forum is jointly organized by Sisters in Islam and Komuniti Muslim Universal, and it's the first in a series of 3 public forums we will be having on this topic. And today we will be having a discussion on the conversations and responses in the Muslim world coming out of the terror attacks in France. So thank you all for being with us today. We are also airing live on Sisters in Islam's and Komuniti Muslim Facebook pages, and you can see the details here on the screen, our hashtag as well as our social media accounts are there. Okay, and well, let's start. And I don't know about you, but I'm feeling rather starstruck by the panel that we have today. Both do not require an introduction, but I will introduce them to you shortly. But first, let's set the stage. On 16th October 2020, Samuel Paty, a French middle school teacher, was killed and beheaded in a suburb of Paris by a radicalized Muslim, incensed by the act of the teacher displaying the controversial Charlie Hebdo cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad in a lesson on freedom of expression. This was followed by another attack, killing 3 in a church in Nice. This re-ignited and deepened conflicts over secularism, Islamism, religious freedom, and freedom of expression, and the French laïcité. France instituted a swift crackdown. Macron's defense of the cartoons has led to ripples across the Muslim world. Islam is in crisis, in Macron's words. The Muslim world reacted. Calls to boycott French goods and Muslim leaders condemning Macron for his plans to eradicate Islamism. Tens of thousands in the Muslim world staged protests. Closer to home, Tun Mahathir invited global criticism when he issued an inflammatory statement that Muslims have a right to be angry, which he explains was not taken in full context, but what coming out of it, it sparked the debate whether the actions by the French were fueling the aggression and thereby further pushing radicalization of pockets of Muslims towards violence. Let me, at this juncture, express our deepest condolences for those who have lost their lives in France and for their families. For many Muslims, equally in Muslim majority and minority countries, there is a real concern of the conflation of the rhetoric and reality, a conflation of Islam and Islamic extremism and terrorism. For many Muslims, the French condoning the Charlie Hebdo cartoons is received as an insult, a blasphemy, and a disregard for matters of highest importance to the Muslim faith. And they are beginning to challenge the ideals of secularism and its accompanying impact of non-inclusivity, even ostracization. They question where the lines are drawn between religious freedom and religious discrimination. What is clear is that the divisiveness has widened, with both divides claiming their identity is being attacked, whilst many here in Malaysia and elsewhere respect the values of secularism, whilst a majority of Muslims hold steadfast that violence is never the answer. We begin to empathize with the Muslims living in conditions where they need to limit their expression of faith. However, the conversation is indeed much more layered and much more complex. So to continue this conversation, we have with us 2 prominent thought leaders and influencers. Let me introduce them to you. Our first speaker is Mustafa Akyol, who is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity, where he focuses on the intersection of public policy, Islam, and modernity. He is a Turkish journalist and author, and his articles have appeared in publications such as the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, Newsweek, the Financial Times, The Guardian, among many others. And he is also a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. He has appeared frequently on CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera English, and on prominent TV shows such as Farid Zakaria GPS and Hard Talk. His TED Talk on faith versus tradition in Islam has been watched by more than 1.2 million viewers. Akyol is the author of Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty, which was longlisted for the 2012 Lionel Gilbert Prize and has been published in Turkish, Malay, and Indonesian. He is also the author of The Islamic Jesus, How the King of the Jews Became a Prophet of the Muslims. Before joining the Cato Institute, Akyol was a senior visiting fellow at the Freedom Project at Wellesley College. He studied political science and history at Boğaziçi University, I hope I said it right, in Istanbul, Turkey. And our second speaker is our very own Marina Mahadeva. Marina Mahadeva is a writer and activist. She has been a newspaper columnist for over 25 years and led the Malaysian AIDS Council for 12 years. In 2010, she was awarded UN Person of the Year for her volunteer work in combating HIV/AIDS. And in 2011, was one of only 2 Malaysians named by womendeliver.org to their list of the 100 most inspiring persons working for women and girls. In 2016, Marina was conferred the Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur by the French government for her voice and charisma to many causes, citing her work with the Malaysian AIDS Council and with migrants as examples. In 2009, she joined Sisters in Islam and served on the board for 6 years. She is currently the chair of the board of Musawa, which is a global movement for equality and justice in the Muslim family. She is an active campaigner for women's rights. Marina has produced TV programs, feature films, and documentaries, and founded a website for women and travel. She also hosts Zafigo X, an annual event on women and travel, and during the COVID pandemic, a fortnightly online chat show called Hello Zafigo. For our participants, there will be time for questions after both speakers speak. And for participants on Zoom, please put the question and comments in the Q&A box. You'll see it at the bottom of the screen. And also please identify yourself when asking your questions. So let us begin the conversation. Mustafa, we'll start with you. The floor is yours. You're on mute, Mustafa.
Yes. Thank you so much, Shareena. And assalamu alaikum to everybody, to you, to Marina, to our hosts, KMU, Malaysia, Sisters in Islam. I'm thankful for this organization, and thanks for everybody for joining us around the world today. I mean, you said the right things. I mean, and thanks for the also great introduction to the topic. I mean, first of all, we should be sad for the people who lost their lives. I mean, there was an elderly woman praying in a church and her throat was cut. I mean, so that there is no justification for any monstrosity like this from any religion, from any perspective. And we should remember that France has lost more than 260 people to terrorist attacks like this. Terrorist attacks done by radical groups acting in the name of Islam in the past 10 years. After all the attacks on Charlie Hebdo, and there was a major attack on Paris several years ago. So any country that goes through a trauma like this will, react somehow. And we should, understand their concerns and security issues. Like any country, Turkey, my country, has gone through a lot of terrorist attacks in the world from different routes. But precisely in moments like these, countries, and especially states, governments, may overreact. And we have also seen this throughout human history, after 9/11, and we've seen that in the US. I've seen that in Turkey, my country. That's why it's important to try to put things in perspective and try to put things in a fair and just way. And on that note, I have some criticisms to the current French government and its approach to the issue, which I outlined in a recent article in Foreign Policy magazine. I said, yes, Islam is in a crisis, so that's the title. But I said, no, French government isn't helping. And what I meant was that, I will come to what I mean by crisis, but I criticize, for example, the approach to cracking down on Islamism, quote unquote, without any definition. So this can lead in France violations of religious freedom. And we already have that in France. I mean, in the past few decades, people who follow France know that Muslim women have been banned from wearing the hijab. I've been very critical of that. And I worry that such bans might become even more aggressive in the current era. That would be wrong. Religious freedom should not be sacrificed to conservatism, any security threats. And by doing those things, the French government will not help its cause, which is integration of its Muslim minority, full integration of its Muslim minority. One can also criticize France and similar governments sometimes for double standards on free speech. I mean, France says, blasphemy is free in this country. People can say whatever they want to say about really any religion, insult them. Okay, you can say that's a standard. But in France, there are laws banning insulting the flag or the national anthem. So these are sacred values for the French Republic. So then there are some double standards. Muslims generally point to these double standards and criticize Western societies. Sometimes they have a point. In America, for example, those bans don't exist. And I think there are higher levels of free speech in the US. So there are differences in Western countries as well. We should just remind that. And I think higher levels of free speech is better. It's fair to everybody. But besides all these questions within Western democracies and all the right criticisms, we can of course always go back to criticize the colonial heritage of France, which always brings a poisonous element to its relationship to Muslim migrants from North Africa, at least to some of them. So there are endless issues, but I think we Muslims also have to look within ourselves, within our own communities, within Islam, the interpretations of Islam today, to see that we have some issues to deal with here, some serious problems. And in this issue, that serious problem is the urge to punish blasphemy by force, by either violence or coercion. The terrorists who attacked people in France in the recent case, they were very extreme. So very few Muslims would accept that if somebody has made a cartoon of Prophet Muhammad or has shown it, that person should be killed on sight. So that is very extreme. That's why we call them extremism. But the broader idea that people who insult the Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him, Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, those people, for insulting the Prophet, denigrating his honor, should be heavily punished. Well, that is not an extreme position. That is right there in traditional schools of Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh. That is why this issue comes up not only with terrorist attacks in France and elsewhere, which is again an extreme interpretation of this tradition, but also with laws in some Muslim majority countries, blasphemy laws. Especially this is a burning issue in Pakistan. I mean, if you follow the news, almost every month somebody gets arrested in Pakistan, goes to jail for insulting the Prophet. Sometimes people can get killed by vigilante groups and their murderers become glorified as the heroes, because they murdered blasphemers. And what is also tragic is that in most cases, there is not even a real blasphemy, but there's a personal dispute. I mean, A Christian lady was in jail for many years, Asya Bibi, for 8 years in Pakistan. She had a quarrel with her co-workers on a farm. She was a poor woman working on a farm. We don't know what she said, but you know, the Muslim co-worker said she insulted our religion. She went to jail for 8 years until the Pakistani Supreme Court wanted to release her. Still, some groups wanted to kill her, so she fled Pakistan and went to Canada. So there is this urge to punish blasphemy by coercion or violence. By coercion, I mean jailing people, violence, directly killing them, you know. And as I said, this has some roots in medieval jurisprudence. If you look at what the Shafi, Hanafi, Hanbali, or Maliki scholars said on Sab al-Rasul, as they put it, you know, insulting of the Prophet, they say, you know, the insulter should be killed. There are differences. I mean, Hanafi say if the insulter repents, he will be forgiven. Hanbalis say he or she should be killed, even if she or he repents. Even repenting, you know, saying I'm sorry wouldn't count. So there are some textual roots for this. Which brings me to my broader discussion, which is there are elements in our Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh, that conflict what modern world calls human rights. There were other issues we solved. I mean, slavery was in our jurisprudence as well. But, you know, a lot of Muslims today now, mainstream authorities said, you know, it was just a historical thing. Actually, Islam's goal was to elevate, to abolish slavery in the long run. So we actually accomplished that in the modern era. So there has been some changes on some issues. We have some taken bold steps. But on this issue, there is a problem. Now, that is why in my forthcoming book, Reopening Muslim Minds, A Return to Reason, Freedom, and Tolerance, I have a whole chapter on this blasphemy issue. And there I argue, and the book will be out in April, but I'll give you a little teaser, if you will, on this issue. I argue that, yes, in jurisprudence, there are those rules, but they really do not come from the Quran. And whether they come from the Sunnah, the Prophet's practice, is very, very doubtful. And it's, I believe, is a misinterpretation. Why? Let me try to explain a little bit, because I think the religious aspect of this issue is really important. And let me begin by noting that no Muslim wants to see the Prophet of Islam, our Prophet, be insulted or disrespected. He's sacred for us, like the Quran is sacred, like other prophets, Moses or Jesus or Abraham are sacred. So of course we have deep respect for him. And the world would be a better place if people respect each other's sacred values. I mean, we should respect other religions, and they should, and there will be a more harmonious world. So I don't glorify any blasphemy, God forbid. I mean, I don't find it as something acceptable from a moral point of view as a Muslim. It's wrong. However, people will say things. They may say things that are hurtful to us. And you know where we learned this from? We learned this from the Quran. In Surah Al Imran, verse 186, God tells the first Muslims, and through them us, you are sure to hear much that is hurtful from those who were given the scripture before you and those who associate others with God. Who were these? These were the Christians and Jews, or the polytheists in Mecca. God says you are going to hear from them hurtful things. And it says, it continues the verse, if you are steadfast and mindful of God, that is the best course. I mean, it doesn't say go and kill those people for saying those things. It doesn't say go and put them in jail or silence them or flog them. It says if you're steadfast and mindful of God. It's about your taqwa. You might hear hurtful things, but it is about your own behavior and own your devotion to God. Another verse makes it even more clear. And this is the only verse in the Quran that really clearly addresses the issue of mockery of Islam. The clearest verse. And actually the verse is actually in two different surahs, almost verbatim it's repeated. But I will read the one in Nisa 140. That's the fourth surah, Nisa, verse 140. And it reads, if you hear people denying and ridiculing God's revelation, do not sit with them unless they start to talk of other things, or else you yourself will become like them. So let's imagine Muslims are walking in Medina. There are some people who are joking about the revelation, the Quran. What can be holier than that? And God says, go and beat those people, kill them. God doesn't say these things. It says, do not sit with them, because those people are respecting your religion. Do not engage in that conversation. That is the only thing it says. There is no verse in the Quran about killing of blasphemers or apostates, by the way, which is another discussion. I had that discussion in Malaysia 3 years ago. And Javi didn't like that, but that's a different topic we'll not get in here. There's really no basis for this kind of violence and coercion in the Quran. In the Quran, Muslims are called on giving a dignified response to people who disrespect their faith. Fahrettin Razi, in his great exegesis tafsir, comments on these verses I quoted, especially Al Imran 186. And he says, some mufassirun, some interpreters, exegetes of the Quran, consider this verse as abrogated, like put aside because of some other verses. But he says that's a wrong interpretation in his view. And he emphasizes that Muslims should be kind to people, even who are not respectful to Islam, so that those people may see the light. That's his approach. And Fahrettin Razi is a great Sunni scholar from the 13th century. Now, let's go forward. If it's not in the Quran, where does it come from? It comes from certain narrations attributed to Prophet Muhammad, or certain narrations about the acts of Prophet Muhammad. And all these happen in the context of war. In Medina, when Muslims go there, they are at battle with the polytheists of Mecca. It's a war of survival. There's a war situation. And some individuals in this war situation, reportedly, are killed by Muslims. A few of them are poets, and they recited mockery or insult to Islam or to Prophet himself, and they were killed, according to these reports. This is what the medieval fuqaha, the jurists, used to say, oh yes, now we have a basis in the Sunnah, we should punish blasphemers by killing them. But when you look into those stories, which I do in my forthcoming book, you see actually it's more complicated. The most important poet in question is a man named Khab in Al-Ashraf. He was a prominent member of the Banu Nadir tribe, a Jewish tribe in Medina at the time, which first made a deal with the Prophet, but then, were exiled because they were collaborating with the enemy. There we see that we read in the Sirah, biography books, that Khab ibn al-Ashraf was killed by Muslims. And they say he was a poet. But when you look what he really did, well, he was not just a poet. He was a man who incited war against Muslims. After the Battle of Badr, he was so enraged that the Meccans lost, so he went to Mecca. He recited poets calling for another war against Muslims. And that was the beginning of the campaign for the Battle of Uhud. This is what we would call war propaganda or incitement to violence in the world today. He was not just a critical person. When you look at other poets, their names are, you can find in books. You see them. One was a poet who was criticizing Prophet Islam, but he also killed a Muslim slave. Another one attacked the daughters of Prophet Muhammad in a caravan. So these people were not just saying hurtful things, they were also active enemies, and Muslims were in a war of survival. So it should be understood within that context. On the other hand, there are stories of Prophet Muhammad doing nothing against people who just said hurtful things. One is a famous story where another Medinan person from the Jewish tribes there named Phinehas quoted a Quranic verse. The Quran calls for giving charity, and he said, Muhammad's Lord is in need. So he was joking about zakat, almsgiving. Umar, Prophet Muhammad's important companion, who would later become the second caliph, got angry and wanted to punish him. And Prophet Muhammad stopped him. And then a verse came and it says, tell the believers to forgive those who do not fear God's days. That was the verse that came on this incident. And according to the, again, stories, Umar complied and saying the Prophet, you will see no more anger on my face. So what I'm arguing is that, yes, there were some killings, but that was not just about mockery. And there are incidents where Prophet Muhammad actually stopped his companions from punishing people when they were just saying hurtful words, because that was what the Quran was saying. So in my view, therefore, this whole medieval jurisprudence of punishing blasphemy comes not from the Quran or the prophetic practice. Although there are incidents there, but I think they, in my view, misinterpreted it. Why? Well, because that's what everybody did at the time. Christian punishment on blasphemy was harsher. I mean, Christians were burning people at the stake alive until a few centuries ago, until in Europe. It was a different time. Criticism generally led to war and violence and everything. So people didn't tolerate criticism in any society, but it was medieval norms. This is like some of our fuqaha thinking in patriarchal terms and thinking that women should always obey men, which doesn't come from the Quran, which doesn't come from the Prophet, but it was their culture. And we should understand that it was their culture, but we should not stick to it as our religion. Therefore, I believe we Muslim authorities should be a bit more, vocal on this issue. And we should establish that we don't want anybody to insult our religion. We don't want to insult anybody else's religion. So that's a better moral standard. But there might be people who say hurtful things. There might be people who say things also that are not hurtful from their point of view, but it might look to us because there are different cultures. I mean, making a cartoon of a historical figure is probably not even an insult to a lot of French people, but it might look different to us. So there might be a gap there as well. But whatever happens, we may boycott a product. We may do not sit with them. We can refuse to engage in conversations that are disrespectful, but we're not gonna be violent on this. And I believe if we do this, if we take this principled position, many Muslims already take this position, but I'm saying in a more clear position with authorities, I think there will be less blasphemy to Islam and more respect, because all these repeated acts of making cartoons of Prophet Muhammad is coming precisely because some Muslims are saying, we'll kill you for this. And the others are saying, no, you cannot silence us. And it just becomes a vicious cycle. I've seen this since the Salman Rushdie affair in England in the 80s. And Salman Rushdie's book became famous and reprinted because some Muslims said, we will burn this book, and there was a death fatwa on him by Ayatollah Khomeini. I think by simply taking a more non-violent and dignified position, we will even disarm some of these disrespectful attitudes to Islam, and there will be more respect to our faith. There will be more respect to our brothers and sisters living as minorities in Western societies. That's why I believe we need a more clearly non-violent and non-coercive stance, and we have the roots for that. We have the resources for that right there in our Quran, right there in the tradition of Prophet Muhammad. So that's all I can say on this issue, at least for a beginning. But thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mustafa. Very interesting insights into the history of Islam in the early days. So let's continue with Marina. Let's hear from Marina. Marina, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sherry. Assalamu alaikum and good evening to everyone in my time zone here in Malaysia. Good morning, Mustafa. Sorry you had to get up so early just for this.
Pleasure.
And thank you to Sis and KMU for inviting me to this first panel on the series on freedom of expression, which I think is a very important conversation for us in the Muslim world to have right now, not least because many of us are living in spaces where that freedom is very limited. First of all, I just want to set my very basic standpoints in case anyone is unsure. on this issue of what happened in France, since that's the focus of what we're talking today. One is that I deplore any act of violence of any kind from anyone. Two, I really am not in support of this Charlie Hebdo cartoons, even though my views on freedom of expression is well known. And I truly find it hard to understand this obsession with shoving them in the face of Muslims. Three, just like Mustafa, I found President Macron's speech patronizing, I guess is the kindest word, in saying that an entire faith needs reforming. And while I agree that there are reforms needed in the way that Islam is translated into actual practice, especially laws and policies in our countries, I don't think that we really need anyone else to tell us what to do about it. I was asked to talk about the Asian response to what happened in France. And although I think I can't speak for every single Asian, and maybe mostly Malaysians, and even then maybe not all Malaysians, let me just say that that there is no justification for violence anywhere. And by that, I mean not just cutting the throats of people you don't like, whether it happens in the streets of France or in embassies in Istanbul, but also everything from the beating of women and children in the home to the bombing of innocent civilians in conflict zones. We can quote from the Quran verses about not taking another living creature's life all we want whenever we come under attack by non-Muslims as a way of distancing ourselves from such acts of violence. But the truth is, the violence does go on. 6,872 Yemeni civilians have died in the Saudi-led coalition airstrikes, and more than 10,000 have been wounded, according to the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. And out of the 10 worst countries for women in the world, 7 are countries with Muslim majorities. Having said that, it's also true that many of the Muslim countries that have found it difficult to develop economically, socially, are those that have suffered under the divisive influence of colonial powers. Once the colonial powers had taken everything from their colonies, they've either abandoned them or kept them constantly dependent in one way or another. Independence may have happened with the lowering of one flag and the raising of another, but in many ways, everything else remains. We'll see how many former British colonies still have colonial laws on their books. In this case, it's perfectly understandable that people should bristle when a former colonial power says things that sound suspiciously patronizing, reminiscent of the heavy-handed way in which they used to tell us what was good for us. Thus, Macron's totally tone-deaf speech about how Islam is in crisis and he needs to reform it could only have been met with resistance and condemnation. But what truly puzzles many Asian countries, I think, even when they're not Muslim, is why the need to constantly provoke and upset people in the name of freedom of speech. And that's probably cultural. There is a huge difference, like it or not, in the way we see things and the way people in France and in much of Europe sees things. But for us, the question often is, what sort of freedom is this if it leads you to losing your life and your people have to live in fear? I'm not saying that it's right for people to react with violence to such provocation, but in Malay, we like to say, tak serik ke? Meaning, aren't you tired of it? This is the thing that we don't understand. What do you actually gain by repeatedly insulting a whole community? How does this make life better for everyone? I do understand that Charlie Hebdo considers itself a satirical magazine that insults everyone, regardless of religion. It's also been known to insult Christianity, Judaism, God knows what else. But I suppose the point is, how come Muslims react the way they do when others don't? I can understand that Muslims feel personally affronted when anyone insults the Prophet, peace be upon him. We revere him and feel that we are all responsible for upholding his dignity. And we wonder why anyone would want to deliberately insult him. The French idea of the right to blaspheme is a mystery to us. Our faith is an everyday thing to us, where almost everything we do is preceded by Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, in the name of God, the benevolent and merciful. And while we can accept that Westerners may compartmentalize their spiritual and secular lives, we don't understand why they should not accept our conflation of the two. But let me point out also that we are not beyond insulting other faiths either. In believing that Islam is superior to other faiths, we already patronize others by questioning the pillars of their faiths, whether it's in believing in a Trinity or in symbols of the different natures of God. Despite believing in only one God, we think that others believe in other gods. And so we even refuse to allow them to use the Arabic word for God because we think it is exclusively ours. Not only is this insulting to others, it's the result of an almost willful ignorance of the principles of other faiths. Some people even think that learning about other faiths would endanger our own, as if we have no confidence in the strength of our own beliefs. Yet in Surah 109, verse 6, God says to us that you have your way and I have my way. Clearly, we believe in different faiths. We can believe in different faiths. One of the things that particularly inflames Muslim sensibilities is the conflation of Islam with terrorism. Of course, we don't like the actions of a few individuals and even groupings like the Islamic State to be considered representative of all Muslims, any more than we consider the actions of the Proud Boys as representative of all white Christian people. But it seems to be the only accusation that we strenuously object to, when in fact there are many other accusations hurled at us that we are ignoring. For example, the accusation that Muslim women are all oppressed. We can debate whether the hijab is a symbol of oppression or not. Certainly we know that there are many Muslim women who wear the hijab and are successful in public life, in academia, in their professions, and in politics in many countries. But we get a bit, we get a bit shaky when we start saying that Muslim women in countries where they are a minority should not be prevented from having the choice of whether to wear the hijab or not. Because the fact remains, in many of our own countries, we don't really like to give women the same choice. We put free hair women under a lot of pressure to cover up because we view them as not sufficiently Muslim if they don't. We say that it should not matter whether a woman wears a hijab or not. It's her talents and skills that matter. Yet here at home, it is precisely whether she covers her head that matters more than anything. It takes an extremely strong woman to withstand that pressure, especially in politics. Appearances matter more than competencies. Another accusation often thrown at us is the issue of child marriage. Instead of getting upset at this, we defend it, sometimes justifying it by saying it is just custom, it's our custom. It's not that we don't know the harm that child marriage brings, both physically and psychologically, to girls, especially, because we have all the evidence, we have all the studies, we can read so much about it. But still we say that in Islam, it is permissible, sometimes by using the excuse that the Prophet, peace be upon him, had married his wife Aisha when she was still a child, a claim that has been disputed by some scholars. In any case, few men these days have prophetic statures. Why do we not get upset about this accusation? Because we know that our statistics tell us that it is so, that child marriages are occurring with little consideration for the welfare of the girl child. Poverty is the reason for much of these, and the COVID pandemic will undoubtedly increase the numbers of child marriages as parents seek to offload the burden of care of their children to someone else. But the question remains, why don't we do something about the poverty that leads to child marriages and other social issues? Why can't we do a simple thing like raise the age of marriage and enforce it? Some Muslim countries like Indonesia have done it, but here in Malaysia, it's still spotty. It's not everywhere, and that's particular to the way our system is set up. Nor have we dealt with issues like FGM, female genital mutilation. Out here in Asia, we say that it's not the same or as severe as the FGM found in the Middle East of Africa. That may be so, but the thinking behind it, to supposedly control female sexuality, is the same. Do we push back against such accusations, or do we defend it as Islamic? The point I'm making is that while we might justifiably protest at being painted as all terrorists, we often forget that sometimes we shoot ourselves in the foot by the way we respond, as Mustafa was also saying. When we respond violently, we only confirm the Islamophobic stereotype of Muslims as inherently violent people. But at the same time, we have to realize that there are other ways in which we can be painted negatively. It's not just in the way we treat women, but also in the way we treat Muslims who do not necessarily conform to what we assume is the ideal. In the way we limit the space for different voices and opinions. There has to be only one way or the highway, and that's it for many, many of us who live in Muslim majority countries. I do think that the freedom to blaspheme is a false and hypocritical one because it's often only in one direction. I wonder what would happen if French Muslims were to start drawing cartoons that insult non-Muslim French people, for example. I don't often see that happening because we're just not like that. And we just don't think that anything religious should be up to such mockery or insult. But I also don't have much truck with those in our countries who say that freedom of speech is a dangerous thing that can only lead to conflict, as we see in places like France. They point to places like France or the US and say, see, this is what happens. The truth is, in our countries, there are very strong limits on freedom of speech, including laws like here in Malaysia, the Sedition Act, where we can land up in jail for insulting human beings in power, let alone the Prophet. These limits are a way of controlling and suppressing us under the guise of protecting harmony. But any close examination will show that those who are punished most severely under these laws are those who criticize power, not ordinary people. The fact that our governments don't have a problem with these undemocratic laws doesn't do anything to dispel the negative views that the West has about us. In other words, we need to clean up our own house if we want to credibly push back against these accusations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marina. I think you've succinctly put what, at least in my impression of the events and the general temperature of many Malaysians out there. So thank you for that. I actually wanted to ask further, Mustafa, on the issue of blasphemy, but you've put it very clearly in your talk just now. But I think the situation now is a little different, a little more distinct, because it is the position of the state that we are talking about here, and I think that is why there is a greater concern than, for example, if it's an individual and it's just left at that, and then you condemn the violence and the situation that's arising out of it. But I think the fact that it's come, it's led to a crackdown on how Islam is portrayed within a country, how Muslims behave within a country. I think that is where the situation now is, perhaps a little bit more distinct, causing more stigmatization and affecting everyday lives of Muslims there. So I just wanted to, take it from that point of view, in terms of freedom of expression and all, where it is, in a sense, state sanctioned, and whether that makes a difference in terms of how we should think about the issue of blasphemy. And we have a question also on the issue of religion and politics and how they seem to intermingle a lot. And I think you also talked about interpretation. So part of the struggle of the Muslims who want to see a more progressive narrative, and this includes Malaysia definitely, is understanding and separating the Quran and the fiqh and the interpretation that comes from it. And without that, then there is a difficulty to look at any reform that is possible within Islam. We need to start embracing that reform is possible within Islam. So I think that across the world right now, we see a lot of overlapping between religion and politics. And I think even in Turkey, we are seeing a shift to a more conservative Islam from its secular past. And the evolution in the past few decades, at least, is that Islam is becoming more and more in the public space. And really, many liberal Muslims do not reject this idea because Islam is part and parcel of our life. It affects every aspect of our lives. So, I would like to ask both of your views. Where do you see the traction towards an Islam that respects a more liberal, inclusive, compassionate, fair, democratic nations? Where are the opportunities within the global environment that we have today? And how do we manage these challenges and conflicts and douse the flames of Islamophobia, which can only lead to further hatred and violence? Mustafa, maybe you could give some comment on that.
Sure, Shareena. I mean, you touched upon a very big series of important points. Thank you for all that. You just mentioned Turkey. Let me say a few things, if you will, on Turkey. I mean, my country, Turkey's story is a thing in itself, and I think Turkey's secular past was also not very liberal. It was secular. Interestingly, Turkey's secularism got inspired by France. We call it laïque, directly coming from the French laïcité. And it had an illiberal or authoritarian strain in it. Hijab was banned in Turkey, for example. I was a big critic of that. Hijab was banned in universities. Now, what happened is that the people whose hijabs were banned are becoming the new ruling class, and their authoritarianism is coming from a different direction. So unfortunately, we couldn't find a balance yet in Turkey, and I think that's a problem for Turkey as well, and similar problems in other countries. On this broader issue, well, first, let me say one thing. We complain about Islamophobia. There is Islamophobia. And Islamophobia, hatred of Islam or Muslims, and maybe that's a better term, has complicated reasons. There are some groups in the world today that will hate Islam and Muslims no matter what we do. They're fanatics, blindly hating people. Who are they? Well, the extreme Serbian nationalists, which launched genocide against Bosnian Muslims in the 90s. Bosnian Muslims had done nothing against them. They were taking the revenge of the Ottoman Empire's war against Serbia in the 14th century. Like, what can you do with that? There are some hardcore Hindu fundamentalists in India that hate Muslims and Islam, and they want to really launch pogroms and make Indian Muslims second-class citizens and oppress them and so on and so forth. So there are some fanatic groups. White supremacists in the US, the one that attacked the New Zealand church. The church in New Zealand, in the terrorist that attacked the mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand. He killed 50 Muslims while they were innocently praying, because he was a sick racist who thought people with different skin colors are living in the West, and that in itself is a crime. So there are people you cannot win. Let's give them that. So there will be forces who hate Islam no matter what. There might be pathological atheists who express any religion or Islam. However, we should also see that there are other people, especially in the West, that they wouldn't have a problem with Islam or Muslims, but they see bombings in the name of Islam. They see people being murdered in Pakistan for so-called blasphemy. They see a lot of bad things happening in the name of Islam, and that brings in them a fear, a concern. Oh, is this religion? So those are the people that we need to have a conversation with. And there, for that conversation, we should explain that all these bad like examples coming out of the Muslim world do not represent the majority of us or the core of our tradition. But also then we should look at why those people are doing that. I mean, there are textual roots sometimes. They have certain interpretations. They subscribe to a Salafi jihadi interpretation, which is not outside of Islam, which is there. So that's why we need the house cleaning, as Marina said, and we have to talk within us on these issues and about these issues with people who would not be Islamophobic out of their blind hatred, but have concerns and issues. You mentioned Islam and politics. Is that correct? Like Islam is being politicized. Now, that is true. That's why we have a term called Islamism. Islamists are the people who think that our states, governments should be Islamized in the sense that they should be run according to the Sharia. There should be hudud and all that. And what they are doing basically is, of course, start not from the faith and the morals, which I would see as the foundation, but from the politics of it, which can at best be a outcome of a pious Muslim society. But also, Islam. What are the Islamists are generally saying? They say Islam should rule, right? Then ask, how is Islam going to exactly rule? We will come to power, and we will bring the Sharia, and we will. You will come to power, right? Yes, I get it. I mean, in all the Islamist movements, there is a party, there is a group that wants to bring the Sharia, wants to bring Islam to power, and themselves to power. So it is a more, and they might not be seeing this in a cynical way, but they themselves see themselves as the best expression of Islam. I mean, imagine Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran. I mean, he was a jurist, and he brought the idea of the guardianship of the jurist. So the top jurist should be head of the state, the guiding light of the state. And who was the top jurist? Himself, of course. And of course, it was Ayatollah Khomeini. He said, and it brought the revolutionary guards to power. So what came to in power in Iran, what Islam was not Islam as such, because God doesn't come down and rule societies. Prophet Muhammad doesn't come back to life and guide us. People in the name of religion doing that. And there's a fundamental problem with that, because it just makes people come to power through a religion and condemn their critics and opponents as enemies of the faith. You criticize them, you become a murtad, you become a heretic, you become an apostate. Why? Actually, you don't have a problem with Islam, but you have a problem with them, but they conflate the two. And this has horrible consequences. This has happened throughout Islamic history too. I mean, actually, according to my conviction, and I make that argument in the book, we have blasphemy laws in Islam precisely because the Umayyads want to kill their critics. The Umayyad sultans that were oppressive, they got some of their critics because they were vocal. They were not murtad or anything. They were pious Muslims, but they didn't buy into the official ideology, so they were condemned. So there are examples of that in Islamic history. And today, all these condemnations, all these us versus them, it just elevates one group above others. That is why it is the idea of separation of religion and state, called secularism, is not a bad idea. I mean, it is a bad idea if it comes and oppresses religious practice. So I have a lot of criticisms towards the French tradition there. But it is not a bad idea if it means government should be somehow neutral and not take sides in one of the different religious interpretations and religious groups. And government should just approach them equally so that they will not try to dominate each other. Quite the contrary, they will just focus on their main goal, which is faith and morality and piety, instead of trying to have political wars and condemning each other. And let's not forget that the Western world developed this experience of a secular neutral state by going through the dark era of religious wars. I mean, we think that the West became secular out of nothing. No, the states became more secular because they've seen Protestants and Catholics killing each other for 2 centuries after the Protestant Reformation. And at some point, thinkers like John Locke said, oh, maybe the state should be neutral. Maybe it should not oppress the heretics. It was a new idea then, but it gained acceptance. And now we have states like liberal states, UK, US, Canada, where Muslims go there if they're oppressed in their home countries. I mean, they give us freedom as well. And the fact that they are not Catholic or Protestant states, but they are states that are neutral, is helpful for Protestants and Catholics and Muslims and Jews and everybody living in those societies. I think we are going through the experience of Islamized politics. So we'll get the same, get to the same point at some point in the future. But we're just bringing each other too much harm and pain and oppression by having these political agendas inspired by Islam. By saying this, I do not mean that Islam should be blind to politics. But one thing is to look into politics and uphold certain values, criticize injustice, encourage justice and fairness. Another thing is to capture political power and say, this is the right Islam, the state has become Islamic and I'm oppressing the other groups. So it's the difference between speaking truth to power versus acquiring power in the name of truth. And I think, like any religion, Islam has political values. Sharia gives us a sense of justice, the 5 values of the Sharia, maqasid. So they are there. They will influence the way politics is done in Muslim societies. But groups that claim to represent Islam do big harm. One more thing, they also cause a lot of disenchantment with Islam and a lot of moving away from Islam. I've looked into this issue actually carefully in the past few years. Muslims might be surprised to learn that the #1 country in the world today which produces ex-Muslims, people who abandon Islam and become atheists or Christians, is Iran. Why? Iran is an oppressive state, Islamic Republic. People who get angry at the state ultimately get disillusioned with Islam and abandon Islam as well. I even see that dynamic in Turkey, unfortunately, when the government uses a lot of religious rhetoric and critics of the government are becoming deists. That's a new trend in Turkey. So I think a lot of people, believe that Islam should have power and impose it for its own sake, for fi sabilillah, for the way of God. Actually, they have to see that they are only harming the faith by that obsession with power. I mean, I don't know if this was exactly the answer to the question, but that triggered a thought in my mind, and that's what I can say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa. Marina, if you would like to comment, I think the question was, how do we manage state control of religion versus personal faith? If you could also touch on that issue. I just want to bring up another comment, which is quite interesting. From one of our participants, and from Heini Skorini, who says that a few years ago I read the book Islamic Exceptionalism by Shadi Hamid. He says that there is something inherent and exceptional in Islam's textual sources and the prophetic example, which makes Islam a more political, legal, and authoritarian religion compared to, for example, Christianity. Marina, perhaps you would like to comment on my question previously and taking into account the comment that's given on the Q&A as well. You're on mute, Marina.
Sorry, what was your question again? It was about state control or?
Yeah, so it was to...
your questions are so long, I forget what they are.
Yeah, so I think the issue is religion and politics, the intermingling of it, the politicization of the religion, and another question was to manage state-controlled religion from personal faith as well.
Well, I think, you know, the mingling of religion and politics nowadays has become the weapon that a lot of politicians use these days, and not just in our country, but in lots of places. I mean, it's a way of othering, and the easiest way of othering, I guess, is to use religion, because it's so hard to counter it in many cases. I mean, if you look here in Malaysia, more and more, where, you know, politicians are using religion as a way of differentiating people, and even if it sometimes doesn't make sense, like in our country, conflating race and religion as one and the same, and that creates this othering of whole groups of people, you know, in a country where we have not small minorities, but large minorities, and it's really for short-term gain, you know, political short-term gain, because in the long run, how do you manage a country like this that is so multi-religious and multicultural and everything, if you're going to really champion only one lot of people, right? And I mean, to anyone who's, you know, sober enough to look at it, it doesn't make sense. But that seems to be the currency in many places, I think, not just us here in Malaysia, which is unfortunate, because as you know, the state doesn't really have much business, to my mind, in trying to control people's faith. In our country, particularly, it's extremely bureaucratic. I remember a friend who is American, and he was marrying a Malaysian Muslim girl, and of course he had to convert because that's what the law says. And he said something which I thought made me really think about it. He said, in America, if I want to change religion, if I want to become Muslim, I just declare to myself, you know, I change my faith inside me. But here I have to sign forms, I have to, you know, go to this office and that office and everything before I'm regarded as Muslim. And I thought that comment really showed the stark difference between actual faith, actual belief, and the, you know, bureaucratic control, the state control of a faith, that if you sign a piece of paper, you become of one faith today, which you weren't yesterday, simply because you didn't sign it yesterday. And I think that puts it on a very, very shaky basis, really. I mean, undoubtedly, there are lots of people who genuinely, sincerely believe and convert or revert, whatever we call it, genuinely, but still have to go through this rigmarole of the state control. But it doesn't guarantee real, sincere faith. I think that's an issue. And of course, once the state gets involved, as we have seen, it really, the impulse is to control, and to control us, that we have to fit in this one particular box of being, you know, a state-sanctioned Muslim. And that's a problem, because people are diverse, people are different. They may have come to the faith from different paths, and they may have different ideas, different interpretations. But once you decide that this is what a Muslim is, as designated by the state, then there are bound to be people who don't, you know, quite fit in. And then their life really becomes quite difficult. And is that what a state's supposed to do? Make your life difficult because of what you believe in or not? And I think that's where the problem is. I don't know what the other question was. Actually, I forgot.
Okay, we'll move on. We have many other issues that we can touch on moving on. We also have a few questions on women's rights and Islam, and I'd like to expand it further, because I think, Marina, you also mentioned, I think it's fundamental human rights and civil liberties even that are affected because they are using Islam to control such matters. You know, so in the case of France, it means that the woman is restricted from expressing her Islamic identity by wearing a hijab. And in Malaysia, it puts curbs on non-Muslims in terms of their dressing, alcohol, and so on. So, you know, it's becoming very much an issue of them and us, you know, and this issue about human rights not being compatible with the religion of Islam. I think we've heard that kind of argument from certain quarters as well. Can I have your comments on it? Can I? Where should the middle path be? How do we inculcate mutual respect and harmony, notwithstanding our faith? Mustafa, would you like to comment?
Sure. May I also just say a few words on your questions on Shadi Hamid's argument on Islam? Shadi is a friend of mine, and actually we discussed this in a panel at Cato a few years ago, Cato Institute. I would say that it is correct that Islam has more political beginnings compared to Christianity. And that is from the fact that when Prophet Muhammad passed away, he had left an army and a state, so he had ruled a political entity, which was continued with the caliphate. But when Jesus left this world, Isa al-Masih, Jesus Christ, he was just the head of a small group of believers. I mean, 12 people actually were following him, as we know from the Gospels. So he was a civil leader. That, of course, didn't stop from Christians, you know, in a few centuries acquiring power through Rome and establishing crusades and religious wars and so on and so forth. But you can say, textually speaking, Islam's beginning has more politics there, which is true. But this doesn't mean that Muslims can look at that experience and can say, well, those politics were just the politics of the day. What is eternal about our religion is not a state model, but the theological and moral teaching about it. In other words, we can distinguish between the prophecy of Prophet Muhammad and the statehood of Prophet Muhammad. And the statehood was just an accident of history, which was required by the context there. This argument has been made by a lot of Muslims, beginning with Abdul Razak in 1925. He wrote a book emphasizing that Islam is a religion, not a state. Of course, some people don't accept it, but that discussion is going on. I should remind that in that sense, Islam actually, if you want to compare it to another religion, is more comparable to Judaism than Christianity, because Judaism, like Islam, is a legal religion, and it had a state in the beginning, an army, Prophet Moses and Joshua, and there was conquests, and that's all in the Old Testament. But many Jews realize that what is eternal about religion is the belief and the practice that is Judaism, but not necessarily a theocratic state. So I just wanted to point out regarding so the second question was about women's rights. Was that your question, Shareena?
Yeah, women's rights and human rights generally, and this argument about Islam being non-aligned with Western ideals and Western type of human rights. Do you have a comment on that? Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I'll say one thing. In all these issues, women's rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, these are concepts that are coming to us from the Western world in the past 2 centuries. In the meantime, we have suffered colonialism from the same Western world, right? I mean, from Malaysia to Indonesia, to from Africa to Algeria, the Middle East has been colonized, and so on and so forth. So there is a strong tendency in Muslim societies to reject whatever is coming from the West. However, if we totally kept this line of thought, today we would have still slavery in our societies. Where did the idea of abolishing slavery come to us? I'll tell you, it came from the same West. And of course, those ideas became universal and so on and so forth. We should be able to distinguish good ideas no matter where they come from. They might come from the West, they might come from Japan, they might come from Africa, they might come. There is just a human conscience that sometimes develops good ideas and values and political systems and so on and so forth. Democracy came to us, I mean, from the same place. Well, we found some of its roots saying that the first caliphs were chosen by shura, not through monarchy. So that was an important basis there. We might find some bases for some modern ideas, but those ideas came, I mean, ideas that there should be ballot box and people should vote. Now Turkish conservatives love that. Well, that came from Europe, I mean, modern Europe. And 1,000 years ago, our ideas were influencing Europe. So it is inevitable that societies will influence each other, civilizations learn from each other. And I think our great Islamic civilization was great in its first centuries because it was open to learning from and contributing to other civilizations. Early Muslim thinkers studied Greek philosophy because they didn't say, this is kuffar, you know, their ideas are all wrong. No, they learned it, and they learned mathematics and geometry and some philosophical ideas as well, some of which were discussed and debated. But that openness is something that's necessary. So we have all the right reasons to be critical of Western colonialism, Western political biases, double standards, aggression, and all of that. But on the other hand, we can say, well, democracy is not a bad political model, because what we had instead of democracy, monarchy, was not also Islamic either. It was just the times, I mean, Umayyads and Abbasids and Ottomans established absolute monarchies, not because the Quran established it, but it was just the world was it was. I mean, they were also modeled on Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire. So first of all, we should bring in the idea that we might get into some values and ideas, and it's not wrong in itself because there's a human nature out of which sometimes good values come out. This whole idea of universal declaration of human rights, when you read it, it was written by a group of people at the UN and declared in 1948. It refers to human conscience as the source of universal human rights, because they have seen it. I mean, they've seen how people were slaughtered and killed in Second World War, and that touched human conscience. So they established the value that everybody has these values. And most of them are compatible with what we believe in, but there might be some tension. So we should look into those tensions. On women's issues specifically, 1,000 years ago, nobody believed that men and women should be equal. No Christian believed that. Jewish people didn't believe in that. Hindus didn't believe in that. Oh my God, some Hindus were burning their wives after their death. That's called sati. There were horrible practices in four corners of the world. But gradually, humans discovered that women are actually, they have the same faculties. They're even smarter sometimes, right? One important change was in the pre-modern era, all work and job, most of them were physical. I mean, being a soldier was very important, and that's done by wielding the sword, and you need a physical strength for that. Yes, there are physical differences between men and women. So many people thought that men are superior than women, but when new professions and areas came, and people realized, oh, there's actually no difference in terms of their capacities. They're similarly smart, they're similarly capable, they have the same talents. So just a physical difference. So that brought the idea, why don't have equal rights? Why don't have the same share? Why can't they vote? Why can't they have the same idea when the family is making a choice? So these ideas came to the fore. And some of our religious texts, if you read what Imam al-Ghazali wrote about women in the time he was living in, 900 years ago, you will see that, you know, good women should obey their husbands, and husbands always know better. I mean, he compares marriage to slavery, and, you know, my husband is a slave owner. But I would say, yes, our scholars thought like that because that's what everybody was thinking at the time. It was not coming from God. It was their culture. And our problem is we turned culture into religion in many cases. The great scholar wrote this, and he's a great scholar. I respect all those great scholars, but, you know, they didn't live in the same time with us. It's inevitable. So we have issues with women's rights. And regarding the Quran, one more thing. When you look into the Quran, there are a few verses that seem to give more rights to men, but we also need to understand the Quran contextually. The Quran was actually radically elevating women's rights in 7th century Arabia, where they had no rights. The Quran was giving a big share in inheritance to women. It wasn't still equal with men, it was half of their rights. But in that society where women had no role, they were always taken care of by men, that was a great amount. But today in the modern world, with the Quranic strategy today, we can take it as equal inheritance. That argument has been made by a lot of scholars, beginning with Al-Haddad in Tunisia and others in Egypt. And today we have Muslim, I mean, I think Sisters in Islam is doing great work and advancing certain ideas. I think it's about, I think the key is to be able to distinguish history from religion. Our religion includes a lot of history, culture in it, which is not necessarily sacred. We should be able to distinguish those. And the second thing is to think that an idea like equality of women is not a bad idea simply because, you know, the person who wrote about it is named John Stuart Mill, but not some Abdullah something. Humanity can learn from each other. And the West owes its success partly because it learned from others, including us, I mean, a few centuries ago. And today we can learn from the West. We can learn from other cultures. It's not just about the West, but it's about being open to humanity's advances that are based on conscience and reason, which are God-given faculties. They're also not against religion.
Thank you. Thank you, Mustafa. Marina, I think this is just in your backyard, the issues on women's human rights and its juxtaposition with Islam. This idea of you know, a Western concept that you know, actually it forms part of the narrative here in Malaysia for certain human rights to be rejected, not applicable to here. Yeah, please go ahead.
Well, I think when it comes to women's rights, and particularly if you're talking about feminism, that seems to like raise people's hackles, you know, almost immediately. And partly, I think it's the same reason as what Mustafa said earlier about human rights, that people think that feminism came from the West, and the West who used to colonize us, and therefore it's a colonizing concept. It's sort of colonizers in another form. They're trying to tell us what to do, etc., etc. But it's really not, to my mind, not very accurate, for one thing, because I just take an example of the laws that we have here in Malaysia, where it regards to women, I mean, a lot of the laws originated when the British came, which was, almost 200 years ago now. And they brought with them their own values. And their values at that time about women were pretty much backward. I mean, married women couldn't own property. They had to hand it over to the husband because they were thought of being unable to manage property. But that was not what was happening in our own customs here. That Malay women had a lot of agency. They could own property. They could complain about their husbands. They could go and demand justice from their local village head, etc. But when the Brits came here and they codified things, they codified it with their values. They instilled their own values into the codification. And so basically what we got was the British version of this, of women's rights at that time. And of course, in the UK now, they've got rid of a lot of these laws that came from centuries ago, but we haven't. We've kept them, and now we think they're ours. And it's that's what I mean by, we haven't quite shaken off colonialism, because we are still carrying on a lot of their laws and thinking that they are ours, and that's a problem, and that includes the attitude towards women. Women, for instance, cannot give their citizenship to their children if they married a foreigner and had the child overseas, because somehow our citizenship is not thought of as equal as the men, and therefore cannot be transferred. There are so many of these things remaining still. Before we had the Domestic Violence Act, the whole idea of domestic violence as just a family matter, for instance. So that's one of the things that we don't seem to realize when it comes to women's rights. But then there's this issue of somehow that women's rights are either already there in Islam, and as Mustafa rightly pointed out, when Islam came, it gave women a lot of rights. But times have changed. There are new challenges for women. Women now are not in the same situation that they were in the 6th century. Now we go out and work. We earn money. Very often we're the heads of our own households. We make our own decisions. We travel, etc. So life is quite different. So you have to meet those realities, or we call the lived realities, and cannot be so unchangeable about these laws. I'm not saying that changing the Quran is, but I think the Quran leaves us a lot of wiggle room and recognizes the dignity of women. After all, it always addresses men and women, so it's not like we are lesser beings. We are, a full part of humanity. So I think what the thing that Sisters has been doing and Mustafa has been doing is trying to unpack this and show that women's rights, human rights, are not at all incompatible with religion, because it is there. It is a matter of interpretation. It's a matter of digging out things that have been hidden by those who control the information. But perhaps a lot of people also don't realize, and I'd like to point this out, because we are, as Muslim feminists, we are sometimes caught in between. On the one hand, there's all these people who say feminist is a bad word, it's a Western word, and we shouldn't use it at all. On the other hand, there is such a thing as the secular feminists who refuse to have anything to do with religion and feel that there is absolutely no room there to in religion that gives women any rights at all, particularly in Islam. As Mustafa said, sometimes this very, very hard line Muslim laws, and is not Muslim laws, but the way the state expresses Islam in a very harsh and hardline way actually drives people away from the religion. We are seeing that as well, because these are the most vehement opposition to the way we take it. Like we feel that there is a lot of compatibility between religion and feminism, but there is great pushback amongst some people, especially those who have experienced a very harsh form of religion. And this is true not just for Islam. I remember working in HIV/AIDS and trying to talk about bringing in faith communities to come and also do the work, because religion is important, and there are many positive things that we can use to have a more compassionate society, etc. And there was a lot of pushback, particularly from those who come from very, very strict Muslim countries and very, very strict Catholic countries. They really wanted to keep religion completely out of it, which to me, I thought misses the mark for some people, because for a lot of people, religion is important. So that is the situation that we are in, but I think we carry on, those of us who call ourselves Muslim feminists, because we feel that there's so much inspiration that women can find from their own religion that actually liberates them. There is a lot in the text, but because they have been stopped from looking at it and learning from it and listening to or learning from different interpretations of it, they've been deprived of this type of guidance, which is there. It's guidance meant for everyone. So yeah, and I think also that to say that human rights is un-Islamic, I think it sounds as if we are undeserving of human rights, and I think that is only said by people who live in very, very comfortable situations. I think situations of great privilege, but once you feel your rights have been taken away, that's when you suddenly think it's important, and you suddenly think that this is I have a right to this. It is my human right to this. You don't talk about it unless it's been taken away from you. So I think sometimes we should check our privilege, and see where we are actually coming from. Yeah.
Thank you, Marina. I think, Sisters in Islam has been around for over 30 years, and this is exactly our work. And part of the struggle is also for people because people receive their information either, from their parents or grandparents. So it's a cultural issue, as well as knowledge given through the education system, all the patriarchal narratives that are out there that, it's difficult to tell them, no, actually the Quran says this and not what you're thinking, what you believe in. Okay, I'd like to move on to another aspect, a question that we have. I'll read it out. What's your take on how Jacinda Ardern and New Zealand handled the Christchurch mosque shooting? She didn't allow much media coverage on the perpetrator, which I believe is a good way to take attention away. from those wanting to have their time in their media, be it right or wrong. So for both Marina and Mustafa, does the panel think the media should have a greater role in helping reframe the Muslim identity? And I think now, with social media as well, I think that's another elephant in the room. So it's to say. Marina, maybe we'll start with you.
Well, I mean, I think like a lot of people, I think that Jacinda Ardern handled the whole thing brilliantly. And I understand why she didn't even want to mention the perpetrator's name at all in the media. And basically the whole idea of that is to take the oxygen away from those people. And because they do thrive on publicity. I mean, part of the reason they do it is to get the publicity, to become famous. And taking that away from them is one way of doing it. But of course, the media is fragmented. I mean, you might be able to control a little bit of your media, but not everything, especially in these days of social media. And so, you know, when we talk about, should the media help in dispelling some of this violence and hate speech, etc. Yeah, it's nice, but I'm not sure how we do it, because it is so wide, it is so fragmented, it is so wild. You know, how do we do it? And I'm not a proponent of, you know, controlling media either. You know, there's especially in our context where our media is not that free anyway. But I think, well, hate speech, I think we need to have some clear ideas of what hate speech is on the media. And I guess the red line is if it it promotes violence of any kind. If someone says, you know, you should go out and kill or something, or you know, stand back and stand by, that, you know, where does that come in? You know, is that just staying on this side of the line, or is that enough? I mean, there's such a thing as dog whistles, where you don't actually have to clearly say something, but people will pick up the signals and do something. So how do you do that? Of course, you know, governments and all have been leaning on Facebook and Twitter and everyone to try and control the more extreme forms. But there is such a thing as the dark web. There's all these chat rooms and things like that. So I don't know. I think the only way to counter that is to behave as best as you can, and to put out good stories as much as you can to counter it. And I think that's what Jacinda Ardern did by behaving like an exemplary leader. I mean, leadership is probably the most important thing. What the leader does personally and in making policies, that's probably the most important thing, so that becomes the story, and that overrides whatever nastiness there might be out there. Can't hear you, Sherry.
I'm on mute. Mustafa, please go ahead.
Sure. First, thanks to Marina for reminding that colonialism actually sometimes brought regression in values in Muslim societies. I myself have emphasized that as well, but because actually on certain issues, the Sharia was more advanced than Western law on women's rights, especially the right to own property.
Yeah.
That's why it's true that when the British colonized the subcontinent, Muslim women who had rights under the Sharia to own property lost it. What I was referring to, though, was more recent idea that came from the West of equality before the law. That did influence the Ottoman Empire, its Tanzimat era, and I think it's been discussed in Malaysia with ISERD and different discussions. So not everything that comes from the West is certainly good, and sometimes that can be regressive. Fascism came out of the West, so there's nothing that blesses. But also we should look into ideas regardless of from which civilization or country or person they originate from. Ideas should be judged by themselves. That was trying to say. And on New Zealand, I mean, I admired the Prime Minister of New Zealand on the way she really hugged the Muslim community after the horrific attack against the mosque in Christchurch. She showed empathy, she showed compassion, and I think her choice of not even naming the perpetrator, the killer, the terrorist, the monster, was right, because those people have a universe in their own in which they become famous, and they have their own audience. So it's good not to give that fuel to them. So I think she's an exemplary leader, at least in that, in the way how governments should really handle these issues. I mean, we need, I think, more compassionate leaders around the world like that in many countries these days. But regarding the broader issue, actually with the attack on Christchurch, before that in Norway, by the attack on actually not to Muslims, but liberal Westerners who are sympathetic to Muslims. And then attacks in synagogues or immigrants in the US. I mean, the Western world has woken up, not enough yet, but still a little bit, that, well, there is another serious terrorist problem here, which is white supremacists. Actually, even a bigger problem in America now, actually, as we hear from the security agencies here, which shows that any identity can go insane, honestly. If they believe in conspiracy theories, if an identity believes that they're under attack, the elites are selling them and they have to do something, it's the same path. I mean, the radicalization of an Al-Qaeda or ISIS militant or a white supremacist is very similar. It's just one is in the name of Islam, the other one is in the name of whatever that person calls himself, white supremacist Western, identity, which shows that, I mean, I'm also fascinated by the proliferation of conspiracy theory in the US, not just among these groups, but there are these groups right now who believe in QAnon conspiracies and all that. I mean, we were criticizing the Middle East, many Muslim societies, for being too much obsessed with conspiracy. Now we see the same disease popping up very quickly in countries that used to criticize this, which shows that, I mean, humanity has similar problems. If people believe that they're always right and they're always persecuted and they have to fight back and everything is justified if you have a just cause, innocent people can be just, collateral damage, that's okay. People end up in doing similarly horrible things. So there is a broader human story to come out of, I think, these events. And I think it's time for Western intellectuals, scholars, policymakers to understand that we are speaking of a global crisis right now. And the media, regarding the media adds to this, of course, and I think it adds when people cluster around certain media group. I mean, there are people who would only follow one news channel and everything, which is very propagandistic, which is very blindsided and so on. They never listen to the other side. And that happens a lot, especially in the times of media, and we should think about this. But on the other hand, I don't believe in giving authority to governments to manage and ban these things, because then when you give a government to ban certain ideas because they're bad ideas, you can be sure that they will ban ideas that are not good for the government. They will ban fake news, which will be about their own corruption or some of their wrongdoings and so on and so forth. I've seen this all over, in Turkey, my country, as well. So it just calls for responsible action. So we need criticism. We need, if there's bad speech out there, we need better speech to balance that. We need to build, and we have more already, but we need to build more media that is interesting, readable, fair, just, and which is disestablishing some of these ideological stereotypes and bigotries that people believe in.
Yeah, thank you. I think also the other issue is that with social media, you know, the pace of the information coming out is so quick, and sometimes, you know, responding to it from an informed way is very difficult for individuals. And I think that's one way that, at least for Sisters in Islam and other liberal Muslim groups, we're looking at how to support that kind of response, you know, in a timely manner. We have another question from Indonesia, and he says that Islam in Indonesia today, for me, is really in crisis, especially since the return of Habib Rizik Shihab to Indonesia, which has increasingly burned the masses toward extremism. Recently, information has also circulated in Central Sulawesi, Poso, that 4 Christians were brutally murdered by Muslim terrorism. I want to ask Mr. Mustafa and Marina how to actually deal with people who practice extremism in religion. It's really difficult. So, Mustafa, maybe do you have some?
Yeah, sure. I mean,
Yeah.
I will not say anything is easy in this field, because the moment you criticize people with very extreme, hardcore views, the more they can declare you a heretic and apostate or CIA agent or that kind of stuff, which has happened to me all my life. I mean, just you can't even begin to have a conversation because they will delegitimize you right away. And then you have to ask, well, who gives you that authority, you know, to define the right Islam? And, you know, ultimately it just comes from their own arrogance and assertion. Well, first of all, I was intrigued to hear the comment, yes, Islam is in a crisis. As an Indonesian, I'm seeing that. Now, this is of course, controversial term. Macron said Islam is in a crisis. A lot of Muslims reacted to that. Well, if Islam is a God-given truth, that, of course, is not in crisis. But when we say Islam, if we mean the whole religious landscape with institutions, scholars, madhabs, fatwas, and everything, yes, we are in a difficult period. Let's be honest about that. You can call it a crisis or something else. Because on the one hand, once we were a glorious civilization, powerful, creative, we lost that in the past few centuries. Muslims have become much weaker. That's how colonialism came at us. There was a time Muslims were the inventors of science. I mean, the top scientists in the world were Muslims 1,000 years ago. Today, less so. And the Muslims who are successful are generally living outside of their countries, if they're scientists and so on and so forth. And we have big battles over religion. And one thing is that there will be hardcore groups. There will be groups who are very rigid. The thing we can tell them is that if you understand Islam in this way, if you think, you know, you should live in a certain way and all women should wear niqab, and so that's, you know, very Salafi and everything. You have the right to do that, but you don't have the right to force that on other Muslims. So we need freedom, and freedom means freedom for everybody. I mean, in America, there are groups called the Amish, right? I mean, they are very conservative Christians. They reject modern technology. So they live in houses without any electricity and so on and so forth. But they're not trying to make all America Amish, right? I mean, they have created their own community and so on and so forth. The problem in our Muslim world is that we have some groups who are very conservative, maybe extremely conservative, And they want to bring that understanding to the public square and impose it on other Muslims, because that's true Islam. We have secularists who want to make everybody secular. That's another problem too. I mean, I've seen that all my life in Turkey. Our Turkey's secularists want to make all women not wear the hijab. Well, why are you pushing for that? I mean, some women will wear the hijab, some will not. It's their decision. It's how they understand religion. Some will wear niqab. Just, respect everybody. That's why when I emphasize freedom, I don't mean emphasize freedom only for less conservative or more secular people. Freedom for the conservatives as well, but we have to come to that understanding. And unfortunately, it comes from the idea that Islam and state should come together. Well, when you do that, actually, you're not bringing Islam and state together. You're bringing your Islam and the state together. You will say, oh, but this is the right one. This is, what Prophet, peace be upon him, gave. Well, no, that's what you understand from that. That's what you understand from the Quran and the prophetic, and you have the right to follow your understanding without imposing on other people. Now, if you come to that point of view, I think we will be more at peace, and we can also have conversations, and even the more hardcore groups, whoever they are, they can be out there. So that's what I would argue for. And one thing those groups do is to delegitimize other Muslims. That's why these issues of blasphemy and apostasy are super important, because if you cannot even begin to speak about this because someone will declare you a heretic and go after you, you can't have any progress. And progress will be just becoming not violent and not coercive, and Muslim societies being at peace and existing there with all their colors. Generally, the demand to establish the Sharia is a part of this. And again, when those people are establishing the Sharia, they're establishing what they understand from the Sharia, their own ijtihad. And if they say this is true, I would say, well, that's true for you. But now there is a, so we should understand, we should establish that pluralism with respect within Islam first. I think that should be the primary goal. How do you do that? Well, I mean, we have to work for it. And I think maybe we're working for it on this very panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Pluralism with respect within Islam. Yes. Very tweetable. Marina, your comments, please.
Oh, I don't have that much more to add, really. I think Mustafa has said it all. That, this idea that there is one interpretation that needs to be adhered to by everybody is a very difficult and often dangerous one. And the ones who are most keen to impose tend to be the ones with the most extreme views. I mean, it'd be nice if someone said, let's all be nice and kind because that's Islamic. That would be great. And I think they would get a lot of people, believing in that. But most of the time it's like, let's, restrict this and restrict that, and you can't do this and you can't do that. And that's Islamic. And that's a problem for a lot of us, so, this is, this is a problem. But also, I must say that this comment from Indonesia that it's becoming, what we think of Indonesia as so much, in many ways, so much better because they do allow for a lot more different viewpoints and debate and discussion on Islam, which we in Malaysia don't get. But it's true that they also do have some groups that are by sheer force of numbers really trying to dominate, and we are seeing there also politicians using religion to gain traction, to gain power, exactly the way we've seen it here. So yeah, I mean, I sympathize with Indonesia, but I still think you have a lot more going for you than we do here, where I think there's just more space there for debate than we have here.
Yeah, indeed. I think real great appreciation for knowledge and you know their grassroots development is also very widespread.
Amazing.
Yes.
I mean, they have KUPI, you know, the what is it, Kumpulan Ulama Perempuan Indonesia, you know, female ulama who are issuing fatwas. I mean, here it's almost unthinkable. So you know, any woman just talking about you know, religion, talking about women's rights is considered already blasphemous. So yeah, I think they're in many ways far more advanced.
The Nahdlatul Ulama also has taken very interesting positions on a lot of recently. I mean, they called for stop using the word kafir, you know, to all non-Muslims, because you know they're not intentionally denying Islam; they're just you know following their tradition. So, I think Indonesia has some interesting points of view from the Islamic tradition that we should be paying attention to.
Yeah, thank you, Mustafa. I think the comment also asked your permission. The commenter also asked your permission to publish one of your articles. I'm not quite sure which one. I think maybe if you could clarify in the Q&A to publish it in Indonesian. I think.
I'll be all up for it, of course. You know, it will be my honor to be published. Yes, sure.
Yeah. Okay, I think we have time for perhaps one more question. If Mustafa and Marina would like to take a sip of water and we move on. And this issue about the polarity of the Muslim community and the non-Muslim community. You know, as a result of whether it be stigmatization or whether because, you know, there's been a new wave of immigration of the Muslims, and I'm talking about the situation in France here. So one of the factors that is being seen as a source of Islamophobia in France is that Muslims in France have not assimilated into the French community effectively. Muslim communities are culturally separated and in many cases physically living within separated communities. We have somewhat of a similar issue here in Malaysia, I think, because we have been talking about a growing polarization between the ethnicities in Malaysia. Malaysia, of course, is a Muslim majority country, but only about 60% of our population is Muslim. So we have a large non-Muslim population here in Malaysia as well. So, you know, I think recently we talk about different ethnicities not being as commingled as compared to, say, 20 years ago. So I think there are lessons to be learned here. And Mustafa, if you could comment on your insight into the situation in France. And I think you've mentioned about, you know, a different approach taken in the States in regards to the Muslim communities there. And Marina, how do we as Malaysians learn from this, and how do we take stock of this position and move forward in a way that creates a stronger Malaysian identity? Mustafa, if you could comment first.
Sure. First of all, I have some criticisms towards the French model that I recently explained in the article that I mentioned, foreign policy article, recent article. And because I think, of course, every country should aim at integrating their minorities. I don't even use the term assimilation, which is a too much, which includes people losing who they are. I mean, it implies that, but integration is the maybe right term, which means those people being fully compatible with the laws and traditions of that country and feeling themselves proud citizens of that country. But this is a two-way street. And of course, you should demand from people in that country to obey the laws, and those laws should be objective and fair. But by assimilation, France is demanding too much. It is demanding that, like a high school student, a girl who should not wear a hijab or should not get a public job by wearing a hijab. The French authorities even took an issue with what is called burkini. You might be familiar. I mean, some Muslim conservative ladies, they have this conservative dress, they want to swim, but they don't want to wear what the most Western people wear as swimwear. It's a French police, I mean, I call it secularism police, searching the beaches to force women to unveil. And do they really believe that when a police comes and forces a woman to take off her burkini, that woman will say, "Oh, I love France. This is a wonderful country," or does she feel insulted and devalued? I think it's the second. So we have authoritarianism in the name of religion, Islam or other religion, but we have sometimes authoritarianism in the name of modernity or secularism and so on and so forth. And France is the burning example of that. I mean, even halal food, demanding halal food in some cafeteria in schools has become an issue in France. Or like there are, for example, cases of a conservative French family doesn't want their daughter to wear, again, swimming suits and go to class with the boys. They don't feel comfortable with that. But the French authorities are saying you're violating laïcité and so on and so forth. I think France needs a higher dose of religious freedom. And it can look to the US, I mean, honestly, on that issue. And even on freedom of speech issue as well. And I think here the criteria should be also, look at the Orthodox Jews. I mean, they have their communities. They are sometimes living in cultural zones, which includes a certain dress code and kosher, but they don't feel alien to that society because the society accepted them. And for a time, there was an ugly anti-Semitism for a long time that we didn't accept. But ultimately, a maturation has taken place there. I think that should be the model for conservative Muslims living in Western society. And it is not an accident when you look into US or Canada, you see Muslim societies that are better integrated, precisely because that sort of lifestyle is not imposed on them as modernity or as requirements. So there are grounds, I think, to criticize France on these issues, on freedom of speech issues as well. On the other hand, of course, we should understand that concern with terrorism and so on and so forth. And it is wrong for French authorities to think that terrorism is taking place because some women are wearing burkini on beaches and we should assume. I mean, this is insane. This is not connected with each other. If anything, you should try to accommodate your conservative Muslim citizens as much and give them respect and space so they can feel French and they can say, I can be who am I in this country. But if you force them to assimilate in the way you want to define it, actually you will have grudges and resentments, which might actually be quite counterproductive to your cause.
Thank you, Mustafa. Marina, the difficult question about the Malaysian identity.
Well, we don't talk about assimilation here because that would be probably even worse than the French idea of assimilation, because that box would be very, very small and most people won't be able to fit in. But yes, but there is a different kind of polarization along racial lines in Malaysia, and the racial can also be juxtaposed with religious lines too. And that's really, again, has a lot to do with politics. For example, there are people here who claim that the reason we don't have unity in this country is because our children don't all go to the same school, which is the national schools. And the answer to that, they say, is to shut down the vernacular schools, the Chinese schools and the Tamil schools, which are in our constitution, by the way. But they ignore the real cause of non-Malays abandoning the national schools. And it's really because of deteriorating educational standards, which is even causing Malays to abandon them and go to private schools and even Chinese language schools because they like the discipline better and things like that. I mean, our education system has become so segmented, not just between national and vernacular schools, but also there are private local schools, private international schools, there are people who are being homeschooled, and not to forget, there are Islamic schools where nobody who is not Muslim goes to, or will ever be admitted at all. So if you really want to talk about unity, the way these people and all that, you'd have to ban all these other schools except for national schools. But as you know, that would be really heavy-handed. Besides taking away parents' choice or what is best for their children. I mean, to me, the best thing to do is to make the national schools the best schools in the country, and that would bring back everyone. They would be the most desired schools. So, if we make these decisions based on politics rather than, sheer practical considerations, then this is what is going to happen. You are going to get, people going in different directions, and naturally, I mean, well, let's be frank. One of the reasons that people are abandoning the national schools is not just because it's becoming mono-racial, but it's becoming religious as well. Heavily imposed religion schools, and that naturally, if you are not of that religion, of course you're going to feel uncomfortable. Of course you don't want your children subjected to that. Of course you're going to take them out. Even for some Muslims are not comfortable with this, and take them out as well. So yes, there is that issue here in Malaysia, and I think the answer to that really is to have more dialogue instead of shutting it down. We are so scared of dialogue in this country. We assume immediately that it's going to lead to conflict because there's no way we can sit down and talk rationally or reasonably with someone else. Well, why not? That's, even these politicians, are they saying that they themselves cannot control themselves? They themselves cannot talk reasonably and rationally with a person of another faith. I mean, what is the issue here? What are they saying about themselves? So, and I think that's the only way. In Malay we say, tak kenal maka tak sayang. If you don't know each other, you're not going to love each other. And so the start of that is to get to know each other. And it seems a sad thing to have to say this after 63 years since independence. But well, that's the way things go, I guess. It's really up and down, and it's really up to the will of the people to bring it back again. But having said that, I think this is a problem that politicians try to stir up. It's not. I think that Malaysians, the ordinary Malaysian, just gets on with things, gets on with life. I mean, there have been many moments when I've seen where people have tried to provoke them, and by, I don't know, burning churches and things like that, and yet we have refused to be provoked, refused to do large protests or things like that, or riot away. We just won't. And I think that says a lot for us, that most of us are actually much more rational than some of our politicians. And that's a good thing. The next thing to do is make sure we elect rational politicians.
Yes. Unfortunately, some elections nowadays might not mean as much as they used to. All right, thank you very much. I think we've had an excellent discussion, but we've come to the end of the forum. It's about 10:06 now. And of course, if time permitted, I'm sure this conversation would have gone on for many more hours, but you know, things have to end. We have to say goodnight. Before we close, I would like to request our Zoom participants to complete the feedback form. It's going to appear on your screen soon, which is being, can we have it displayed? So it's a short one, only 2 questions, and it will help us a lot in our future work. So please fill up the feedback form. It's been a very enlightening discussion, and I think our 2 speakers have simplified for us the complexity and the breadth of issues and the intersection of rights and discrimination, of freedom and mutual understanding, and indeed provided us with much to ponder on. I'm sure we will continue these conversations within our communities and within our families. Here in Sisters in Islam and Komuniti Muslim Universal, we will continue the conversation next week, considering the impact of the developments on our region, the Nusantara. So don't forget to mark it on your calendar. It will, we will send reminders through our Facebook page as well. I think we have a poster. Yeah, but you have to remove the, yeah, we have a poster on this. This one is the next one on the 9th on the ripple effects in the Nusantara. Lastly, on behalf of Sisters in Islam, Komuniti Muslim Universal, and all our audience, I would like to extend my thanks to our 2 brilliant speakers tonight. Thank you very much for being with us for the last 2 hours. It's been a great discussion. Waalaikumsalam. Thank you and stay safe.